We all know the mantra of Liverpool FC in the UK, you'll never walk alone. And that now brings us into our next segment, which is basically dealing with the development of grassroots football, development of football in Kenya from the grassroots level. And I'm joined here by Mr. Daniel Wahome, who is from the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
And Daniel is here to talk a little about football, and who better than him, because he's a seasoned sports journalist and he has a passion for the game. So Daniel, first thing I want to ask you is, what is your take on Jacob Gosmule coming back to Harambee Stars?
Well, it's just a reflection of what the country is like when it comes to a lot of the development of the coaches, people who've got high-level qualifications, worked at the highest standards. So they tend to be a few and wide, and those who have got those high qualifications at times tend to look out for CAF educator jobs. So yes, they're actually coaches of coaches. But for Jacob Gosmule, what does he bring in? He's been a pundit for so long, analyzing the game. He's been involved at his last real direct job in football was as a football technical director. That was until around 2016. Yes. So what is it that he comes back with after 4 years? That's a question that's going to be asked. His first test is just under 2 weeks. And it's how he handles the whole situation. Yes, and what are some of the things people are asking? Yes, you handled the Harambee Stars 4 times. Yes. What's different this time round? Has there been, like the conversation that's coming up of grassroots development, can he tap out from the best of the talent, or is going to rely on the foreign legends?
Well, they say the 3rd time's a charm. So maybe the 4th time is 4th is a score. You never know.
Or a punch.
Exactly. Recently we discovered that our good friend Cristiano Ronaldo is, unfortunately, he's come down with COVID-19. Hence, he couldn't have that reunion with Lionel Messi. And this has really hit soccer in a big way globally. What do you think is going to be the new normal in terms of going to the stadium? Are we going to have sanitized booths? Are we going to be maintaining social distancing? Is it going to be the new normal?
Well, you've got to look at different countries differently. And I'll try and look at sport, especially spectator sport in stadia, from different perspectives. If you look at New Zealand, and they played against Australia, the stadium was packed. So this is 100% dependent on every country that's there. Yeah. Just across from Kenya, in Tanzania, they had a fun day, 60,000 people for Yanga and Simba, different days. So it's actually based on the policy of the country. That's why in some countries they could allow fans and allow you to get, the physical distancing is there. Or if you come from the same household, then they know these are people who are in a particular way. But over time, sport has shown that you can get back to action. I don't think there is anything bigger than sport across the world that has worked that way. The whole thing of virtual viewing experiences, for example, like with the NBA, where they had the bubble. But overall, sport is going to lead the way back into what is being referred to as a new normal.
Now, the elephant in the Kenyan room when it comes to football, FKF.
It's a huge elephant. They say the biggest elephant in the world is in West Pokot County. It must be bigger than that.
What's your take on it?
Well, it's all about how, at the end of the day, federations can self-regulate. That's a whole world of sport. The world of sport works a lot around self-regulation. But the question is, you cannot exist in a vacuum. If you have to open a bank account, you must be registered as a person, legal or human, by the government, and in this case, it's the sports registrar. Exactly. So I think that the biggest discussion that that's going to be there over the next few weeks is the registration of county associations for sport. I know there is a decision that says that may or may not happen depending on the legal framework, but overall, how do you manage that? I think already 6 counties have registered independently from aside from those who are elected. So how do you avoid this chaos? Because at the end of the day, you can't have football being played in a chaotic situation. I think it's only something like a header around a corner that is allowed to be chaotic in football. But beyond that, nobody wants the chaos.
My final question, Ulinzi FC coming back home to Nairobi. It's a great thing.
It's a great thing. For Ulinzi, yes, they started off at Waterworks. They were based off somewhere just past Westlands. So that's the story. And for the military, overall, when it comes to sport, they have They had a rugby team once. Now they've got a football team. They've got a basketball team, a volleyball team. Let's not even talk about the athletics team, because that's another story. But having a complex of their own where they can all come together, can train, and if you've got their championships, then it's not a problem. You don't have, if it's a cross-country championship, it's at one place. No, or they can take it to different barracks as they wish. I mean, they all belong to them. But this provides a great opportunity for the sportsmen who serve in the Kenya Defense Forces to say they can all train at one place.
Thank you, Daniel. So without any further ado, I am going to introduce the next panel on the development of football in Kenya from grassroots level. Daniel will be back at the end to have a bit of a tete-a-tete. And the moderator is Mr. Milton Nyakundi, who is a seasoned sports journalist with over nearly 2 decades and has of experience, and has hosted TV shows and has written extensively on sports matters throughout his journalism career. And he will be joined by Mr. Tim Leg, United Kingdom. Tim is a progressive football professional with extensive management and coaching experience around the world. He'll be joined by Mr. HUSSEIN MOHAMED, who is the CEO of Extreme Sports Limited. And he focuses on developing football, especially at the grassroots level. Brian WESAALA, who is the founder of the Football Foundation for Africa, will also be a panelist. And Mr. JAI SANSHARMA is a specialist in football knowledge and theory. I think he's going to tell us a little bit about what exactly that is. So without any further ado, Mr. Milton Nyakundi, sir, take over.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Daniel. In this new normal, we are coming to you virtually, and we won't get tired reminding you to stay safe. As always, keep social distancing, mask up, and always ensure that you sanitize and wash your hands. This is the elephant in the room, as Daniel and Chris were saying, because it evokes a lot of emotion, a lot of passion. And I want to appreciate the role that Chris has played in introducing my panel. They are already here. And we are going to get straight into it in terms of the development of football in Kenya from the grassroots level. And I must admit that I was really touched by the movie that we saw from Iran about the club in Malavan, and literally it brings the whole town to a standstill. And I'm wondering, as I rope in my panelists, and I would start with you, Brian, when we're talking about grassroots football development in Kenya, from your experience, just give us a broad overview of what that really entails, putting in mind that this is really the melting pot of talent in Kenya and around the world. Brian.
Thank you, Milton, and thank you to Keith for this invitation. As I said, I'm Brian WESAALA from the Football Foundation for Africa. I think your question is really important because in different contexts, people understand grassroots football differently. In the Kenyan context, I would say it's basically all football that is not elite or pro, which is actually the bulk. And people will always say the grassroots is the foundation for what you have in football. So it's very, very important. And since from a global perspective, you are all working under the pyramid structure, then the grassroots is at the bottom of this pyramid. And how we develop grassroots, or what grassroots really entails, is important that we clarify, and even in some cases, try and change our view of grassroots football development, because we need to make grassroots football create the right opportunities, not only for our players, but for other stakeholders within the industry. So football outside the Premier League, outside the NSL, here in Kenya, it's all grassroots. Be it at the youth levels or any other organized activity, organized football, outside of these two institutions, organizations, I see it as grassroots. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And picking up from where you've left, let me bring in Hussein now, from your experience in terms of grassroots football. What is your experience, and is it just about everything else except the elite football, as Brian says? And you've been running Extreme Super 8 for the last 15 years or more. What is your experience, and are there any challenges that within the Kenyan context? Hussein.
Thank you so much, Milton, and the panelists and the organizers of this webinar. As Brian has said, grassroots football to us by definition is predominantly amateur football or community-based football played within your locality that is not professional football, and that is what we focused on the last 15 years in terms of development of the game. And one, of course, of the things that we also look at when we talk about development of grassroots football is what happens off the pitch. So one of the key challenges we've had over time when we're organizing our Super 8 leagues and Super 8 games is bringing professionalism to organized football. It does not necessarily have to be at the social gaming stage, but also at the organized amateur football level of the game. So as long as it's being played within the community, you'll have various challenges. Infrastructure is one of them. Having the clubs organize themselves in a professional way or have some form of governance structures within the clubs is another issue that you have to deal with at the grassroots level. However, these challenges also vary from region to region. We are predominantly based in Nairobi, which is the most populated urban area in the country, and it also poses its own challenges compared to the rural areas. So grassroots football is an exciting space to be in. It's the largest, as Brian rightfully says again, and challenges vary depending on who you're dealing with, the age groups you're dealing with, and also the gender, because then you've got women football, you've got boys football, and all of them have different challenges. But the common one across the board is, of course, matters of governance. It's support from all the stakeholders, matters to do with integrity, matters to do with credibility of organizers and people who run football, and not only at that grassroots level, but also across the spectrum.
Well, thank you, Hussein. Let me bring in Tom. Tom, you have experience having been in Kenya here and in Europe. Give us a bit of a context in terms of how does development of grassroots football, from your experience, what are those specific components that then must be in place for this to happen and for it to be effective or efficient, as it were?
Well, I think you've first got to define what you want from your grassroots game. For example, the grassroots game in Europe, it looks very different in England as it does do in Spain, as it does do in Germany. So, we use this term grassroots football, grassroots sports in a homogenous way, but ultimately the way in which grassroots sports, grassroots footballs takes place is very different from country to country. So I think before we even really start getting into the conversations around Kenyan grassroots football, it's around what do we want from the game? And I mean, Hussein kind of touched on it there on some of the important elements around governance. And when we talk about governance, it's not necessarily from the federation or from the government. It's governance from within the clubs. It's their own capacity to effectively manage their own internal structures, to be able to develop their organization. From a coaching perspective, that may well be coach education. From the players' perspective, it's about having club structures in place to be able to develop players. So grassroots football takes many forms, and Brian touched upon The fact that, again, grassroots football is a very generic term, but in England, for example, when we talk about grassroots football, we talk about senior football. We talk about players who are 18 and above, who are playing informal, in some senses, and non-professional football. Whereas in other countries, grassroots football can include academies and junior football. So there's, grassroots football is a generic term, and I think it's important that we kind of clearly define what we mean within that term, and then further from that, what we want from grassroots football within Kenya. And what we want from grassroots football in Kenya depends on what outputs we're expecting, be that from a national level, from a local level. So there's a lot to unpick in terms of that generic term of developing grassroots football within Kenya.
Well, we're also inviting you to share with us your thoughts, what your understanding of this subject is, and how can we then adopt that common position, that common understanding in terms of what we need to do for grassroots football in Kenya. But Jay, I would want to get you help us to have some consensus here in terms of harmony of thought so that we move forward. And as you do that, I would wish that you give us those specific boxes that need to check for us to say then that we are talking about grassroots football, and then does it have a connection? Is there a linkage from the grassroots football? How does it build then to the higher level in terms of football development and exploitation of the game, as it were?
Absolutely. So first, thank you for having me. Just to build on what Brian and Hussein and Tom have said, I think that it is very important, of course, to have the goals in mind of what you are trying to achieve and have that well defined. From there, it becomes easier to work backwards and know kind of how you would like to achieve those goals. So formalizing the youth leagues is a very good part of that, and that is of course relevant to the women's game, to the boys level as well, and that in turn will help develop the professional level. In my experience, I've been a coach in a college team in the US, and you can see how grassroots football in the US has developed since the turn of the millennium. There's been a lot more emphasis on education when it comes to women's football, when it comes to educating the coaches about the structure of football organizations, and in turn that knowledge passes down to the players. It becomes then somewhat of a self-supporting and self-regulating organization, as was being mentioned previously as well. And I think that all of these aspects play into the overall role that helps develop football from a grassroots level through professional level as well.
Let me try and now be specific here, and I want to get Brian and Hussein on this one before I get Tom on board. Who plays what role in what we are talking about? For example, who are the stakeholders that have that direct, involvement in terms of now developing football in Kenya from the grassroots, and what is that smallest unit that we call grassroots? And I'm saying this, Hussein and Brian, you'll bear me out, that everybody in this country talks about grassroots football, and I mean, as various as the interpretations may be, but what is that smallest unit that then forms the basic unit for grassroots football? Hussein, others would say Super 8 is a form of grassroots, but is that the lowest level? Is that the highest level? What are we talking about here? Let me begin with you, Hussein.
I think it depends on where you're operating from and what kind of activities you're running at the grassroots. It could go as low as to your estate or to your village, wherever you are, and that could be considered as grassroots. Are you playing for social reasons? Is it just a form of socialization, or are you playing competitive football? That again is another variable you need to factor in. So it can go as low as or as macro as to your school level or to your estate level, or just you and your neighbors, and that's grassroots football as well. But it's mainly for socialization purposes. But as you get more into organized football, then you start having leagues within your locality, within your constituency. More specific here in Kenya, we have constituencies, we've got wards, we've got the county level. All that is grassroots level. The more competitive the games get, now you're moving from amateur football to, and you want to, the players to want to move to professional football, which is now playing for the top tier leagues. In regards to who is responsible for the development of football at the grassroots levels, or who are the stakeholders, in my opinion, really, it's everybody who's a lover of football. As long as you play football at whatever level, you're a stakeholder, and you should be involved in the development of the game within your sphere of influence. So there's a certain level of football at the grassroots that cannot be managed, or should rather not be managed by anybody in particular. It takes a natural course, and then as we get closer to getting it more and more organized, then you've got the government, then you've got the federations getting involved, and so on. But in terms of who should regulate grassroots football, in my opinion, it's impossible to do it anyway. You shouldn't, and it's impossible to say that you will regulate all grassroots football. It's not possible. People play football anywhere and everywhere all the time.
Brian, as you come in, and I like what Hussein is bringing up, because it has been a subject of controversy, especially dealing with the federations specifically. Brian, can we just leave it open like that, or is there need for regulation? And if that regulation would be there, how should it be?
And just to say that I agree with Hussein when it comes to regulation of grassroots football, if you can even talk about regulation of grassroots football, that is. Simply because from the start we said it's the bulk of the industry, if we have one. I can say more than 95% of football activity in this country is grassroots football. And therefore it is impossible for one organization or even two organizations to seem to regulate grassroots football. So yes, I agree with saying that this is an open platform. Any lover of football with good ideas, with progressive ideas that are beneficial to the football and to our communities should be able to play a part in the development of grassroots football. And we see that already in a country like Kenya. Of course, the federation is the assigned custodian of football in the country, but we have NGOs, both local and international, that have come into the space. We have organizations like Hussein Extreme Sports, which have been doing some good work over the last 15 years, mainly here in Nairobi. I have the Football Foundation for Africa, where I'm planning to see how we can drive more resources into grassroots football. So yes, it's an open field. If I want to go outside and play football with my friends, nobody should regulate that. But then we go back to what Tom Leg mentioned, and I think that's very important in guiding us. What do we want to achieve, or what outcomes do we want from football? And it is these outcomes that should guide the formation or the organization of grassroots football in different communities. When you ask about what is the smallest unit, it's very difficult to come up with the smallest unit of football. I mean, we have very ad hoc arrangements, especially now we are seeing coming together, that was pre-COVID, that is, playing small-sided football games, just arranging that after work at the end of the week. How do you regulate that space, for example? So it's very difficult. So yes, I tend to agree with Hussein. It's an open space, but we need to be guided by the outcomes which we are looking for to develop grassroots football.
But before I let you go, Brian, I mean, are we then saying that any Tom, Dick, or Harry has can just enter that space and run, stuff around? Isn't there, or shouldn't there be a form of, guided entry, guided participation, guided generation of resources? I mean, and resources here, I mean, all the capital that you need, the finances, the human capital, the skill sets that are required. Isn't there that kind of, melting pot in terms of somebody who then, sets the ground rules or guidelines?
When it comes to football, I will reiterate, anybody should be able to get into that space and play, and they should be guided by the outcome. We're not saying every Tom, Dick, and Harry should come and run football in the country. At least we need knowledgeable people. And at the end of the day, I think when we're talking about Kenya, for example, our first, we have a responsibility to our government. So we need some kind of regulation or recognition from the governments. And I think one of the smallest units you can organize yourself in here is a community-based organization. So as long as you have that legal mandate or that legal representation, then you should be able to do something with football. Again, as Hussein said, as we develop, as we get into towards professional football, that's when perhaps the federation should take more control, or the government should take more control. And again, here it's the government at what level, because we have our local authorities and all that, which can play a crucial role in the development of grassroots football. So yes, anybody should be able to get into that space and do what they want with football. But at a certain level, regulation has to come in.
Well, very well said, and I know we're likely to get into trouble for having that kind of position, especially with the powers that be at the federation. And Hussein is a perfect example in terms of how sometimes the powers that be within the federation have tried to be overbearing in terms of, wanting to control everything and constrict everybody into, having to do things in a certain way, and for lack of a better word, trying to please certain individuals, if you like. But let me bring in Tom and Jay here. Is there any ideal approach in terms of now? I mean, we are talking about Kenya, where everybody should be given the space to be able to enjoy their passion in the game, but at some point regulation has to come in. So what is that ideal framework within which then this regulation could happen? And I want us to exhaust that very quickly, then we move into the next stage of this conversation in terms of what support structures then are required for this grassroots development to happen.
From my perspective,
or Tom?
Yeah, we go back to the point I raised originally around what are the objectives of what is our understandings of the objectives broadly of grassroots football, but then even from a micro perspective, what is the club's objectives? What is the club's what is their own institutional objectives? Do they simply want to operate as a community club which represents that locale and is purely for recreational purposes, and it has no aspirations above that? If that's what its purpose is as a club, then I don't think those clubs should necessarily be forced to register as clubs with federations. It's healthy for those clubs to be able to have the flexibility and the freedom to be able to do what they choose to do. engage with NGOs on a different basis. I think that's healthy for football to have clubs at a very, very micro level within communities who have the ability to be, as I say, flexible in their operations. But I think that what Hussein and Brian are echoing, I would agree with. At some point, if a club has aspirations to move up the pyramid within the FKF structure, then it needs to be willing to meet regulations in terms of club registration. And I think those two can't coexist if there is ambitions to grow, but there is friction around wanting to be involved with the federation. I'm afraid that it's going to be difficult for those things to work. So I think having the freedom to operate is important for clubs, so long as it meets their own internal ambitions. But if clubs want to progress, then they need to be willing to meet regulations. So I mean that would be my part. I have other points as well, but I'll let Jay come in at this point.
Jay, your thoughts?
I would like to echo as well what the other three panelists have said. Of course, building on the points, it comes to a place where it becomes important to think about when each organization will receive the platform that they would like. As you mentioned, there is a concern of, can any random person go in and formalize an organization, and then when they would like to elevate that, would they be able to do it on their own whim? And I believe that, as Tom was echoing, you have to consider the ambitions of the project. You have to consider what the players would like to achieve within the organization, and of course that's more internal. But it really comes down to what is the goal of each organization, and that you can break that down from the level all the way from the FKF down to say the amateur leagues, and then even to the grassroots level, because each group will have different ambitions, and they will also have a different platform on how to execute that. And I think that is the crux of how to approach giving each of these organizations the platform that they would like to progress.
Well, gentlemen, I'm getting your drift, and it becomes interesting for me when we all agree that it should be a free environment for people to enjoy. But let me bring the context here. For example, in Kenya, and I'll start with you, Hussein, on this one. We have the Sports Act, and there are certain provisions that then become mandatory within the context of the Kenyan law. Now, how then do we get the resources if we would have, such kind of free environment? How do we institutionalize resource mobilization using the law, and again, without appearing to overburden, or being overbearing or too restrictive? How do we strike this balance?
First of all, I think this Act 2013 has got its flaws, and it requires a bit of an overhaul. There was no provision, or the writers of that particular act did not envision a situation where you would have private companies also participating within the sports sector. If you look at the Sports Act, only federations, where sports associations are required to register with the sports registrar, but there's no private entities or private companies or non-profit organizations to participate as sports institutions now. So that is something that needs to be dealt with later on. When it comes to resource mobilization, a good example is our organization, Extreme Sports. We have not been dependent on the taxpayers' revenue or money in that matter. We have always raised it from private institutions, from the corporate world, and from development partners. And it has been self-sustaining for the last 15 years. We've not gotten a shilling from the federation or any support from the federation for that matter. and it's running, and it's been very successful. One of the most popular leagues in the region, the grassroots leagues in the region. You know very well we won the 2017 Best Grassroots League in Africa at the Discovery Awards, and that was because of the consistency and our ability to raise sponsorship from private. So when it comes to resources, if you are well organized, you would be able to do that by yourself. But the Sports Act in itself requires an entire overhaul. The way it is designed today, that's why we have got all this fighting, and we've got all these issues with the legality of the federation as we speak, because many people would argue that it is not legally constituted, because then they have not met the minimum threshold as stipulated in the Sports Act. A lot of work needs to be done in that regard. We need the right people also with the right sort of vision and the right sort of zeal to be able to implement that. However, just to point out what Jai said and Tom and Brian, in terms of what is the common factor, common denominator when it comes to grassroots football, it's the motivation and the ambitions of each organizations that they participate or the institutions that they participate in. So at the end of the day, if you know what you want to achieve, then the path becomes clearer. I don't think that from government or from the federation is a big issue.
Well, I think you've said. I want to bring in Brian and the rest of the panelists. But as we do this, Hussein has brought in a very important component in terms of the corporate world, and as long as you have the vision, then your path is very clear. But what sort of other partnerships become necessary? And Brian, I ask this because sports within the Kenyan administrative structure is a devolved function. And you have the county government, you have the national government when you look at the Sports Act itself. So what sort of partnerships are necessary for this then to be seamless?
I think in this regard, I can say, again, going back to the outcomes and giving the example of what I'm trying to do with the Football Foundation for Africa. For me, at the core of my strategy is education and health of footballers and other stakeholders in the space. So I have to look for partners who buy into that vision or who are in line with my strategy, because for me it's not just about football development. For me, grassroots football, or for the Football Foundation for Africa, grassroots football is about human development. So I look for partners who buy into this vision for the country, and these are in government at all levels or in the corporates, because we are happening now when it comes to the employability of young people. For example, the health of young people. So many people are keen to invest in these spaces, both locally and internationally. So it's about us, the different players in the industry, to fashion themselves, to be able to welcome investments that align with their visions.
You're bringing in a very interesting aspect of development of football at the grassroots. And if I get you right, Brian, and I would want to get your professional view, Jay, on this. Are we also saying that, football for development, or football, the component of football as a driver of life skills, is part of grassroots development, and it should be mainstreamed in our thought processes, Jay?
I think absolutely. Having seen kind of what Brian was mentioning, I think it's very important to consider this, and as you suggest as well, I think that it's very important to keep in the forefront of the thought processes while going through the formalization of making these structures and setting these institutions up within society, but then also within what we expect. Because once you have achieved that, then it becomes, say, easier to achieve what everyone is in agreement for. So if everyone hypothetically then has the perspective that football is not purely for the financial gain, for the recognition in terms of fame, that it really is for your health and for doing as a person, then it brings humility to the sport. And I think that's something that's very and can be taken very far if you look at the game. And there's a great example of looking at, for example, this game, how it's developed in England. Clubs were trying to bring a larger platform to their women. Then they had struck a deal with Sky Sports, I believe, and they had organized that free of charge, Sky would be playing their matches. And I think that also inspired countless young girls and women to see that there is an audience for what they love to do, and at the same point that there's real development that comes from that. So exactly as Brian mentioned, I think it's a massive component to consider the health aspect and how that helps develop people as well.
Tom, it is more than just playing the game from what I am getting. And how broad can this get in terms of the development of the game itself, from the amateur all the way and connecting to the professional level? But are there other developmental components? And I want us to talk about in the infrastructure that is necessary for this then to thrive. How broad can it get in terms of that? Tom.
So I think having this broad view, that healthy, when we're talking about football, I think we need to specify exactly what we mean by that. So, for example, for the arguments of this conversation, I would say grassroots football pertaining to senior football, which is played at a community level, all the way up to a point at which teams can become semi-professional or professional. That is both in the men's game and the women's game. I would disregard things like youth football, for example, academies. I personally feel that it is unhealthy to have a broad view of grassroots football, because we then spend all of our time talking about broad subjects and broad issues, and we never actually get down to talking about the key things that need to be delivered in terms of creating really flourishing for football to grow up in Kenya. There's a lot of structural things that can be done around utilising grassroots football to, as Jay was mentioning, as Brian, around promoting healthy lifestyles and healthy living. Those can be done formally or informally. Formally around education, but informally by the mere nature of football. You are leading you are a healthier lifestyle than you would do if you do not play football. But I think for us to be able to, to address grassroots football within Kenya and look at major improvements within that space, we define that as, I think Hussein with sort of institutions as well. And I'm a believer that, again, if you have that flexibility in your operations, and you have the ability to be able to go organisation potentially how you see fit, I think there are responsibilities within that. Responsibilities in you being able to drive revenues for your club to survive. We look at it in the KPL in a professional level in Kenya, or the Bet King Premier League. Around, there is still a tendency for clubs to be given the financial aspect, and I think that mentality can sometimes to the grassroots game. It's healthy for clubs to ownership, still their own structural, but then also in how they raise capital, how they raise revenue. And I don't mean, I don't have any illusions that that is a difficult process, can you? But just because it's difficult doesn't mean that it's impossible. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't attempt to try and do it. I think if people can create grassroots clubs which are connected to their communities and where they come from and have operations that give back to those local areas, I think those become very propositions for corporates to come and invest in. So I appreciate I've probably gone off on a slight tangent there, Milton, but I hope I've.
Well, we are into the final quarter hour of this discussion, and interesting perspectives. And as we take this home, let me understand in terms of the drivers for this development. Football has to be played on a football pitch. It requires certain skills and personnel for this to happen. So what are these specific drivers, and what sort of synergy is required, considering, for example, that as an organization, and especially within the Kenyan context, you may not have your own, football pitch, for example, or access to stadia. So how do we put all this together in terms of the stakeholders, so that then the synergy can be there for the results that we, anticipate to be there? Let me begin with you, Brian, from the Football Foundation for Africa experience.
Thanks, Milton. I think I'll just go back to Tom Leg a bit, and maybe I'll differ with his opinion in terms of focusing on football development, especially, and we have done years not working. There is a strong need to have a change in approach to what we think is development, and that's why I think we should start streaming sports for development or football for development, so that even these clubs or academies, you look around at the academies we are talking about, I think very few would even be qualified to talk to as academies in these contexts. So I think it's very important that we look at these clubs, football communities, and see how best can we fashion them into assets that are for the communities in which they live. And that's only by taking a football for development approach. Football for football, yes, it will work for a few, and we can, yes, also come up with the elite youth kind of development, but that is a very narrow scope, or rather it covers a very small part of the population that are football. And so at the expense of a majority, which we say is more than 95% of the football. So in terms of stakeholders and the creatives that work, again, is how do we fashion people in the football industry that we are attracting our stakeholders? Your infrastructure. And we are telling the government, invest in infrastructure. The government will be asking, invest in football infrastructure. So we need to answer that question. We're not going to tell the government, for example, that we are developing footballers. Does not need footballers, for example. Kenya does not need footballers. We need people who can contribute to development of the Kenyan society. How can football contribute to this? That's a very great convenience people on how we can move the country forward, the continent forward. This is what we can sell to our government. Look at our fund sponsorship. What are we offering? You might talk about visibility, but in this area, visibility is not. We need to sell something different. So we need to be innovative. That's why we players in this space, innovative ideas that we can be able to produce so that they can invest. But continue the approach, develop football, in my opinion, in my view, we will be doing the over game and different results.
Thank you, Brian. That is a very, very interesting. I wish we had more time to delve further into that. But Hussein, when Brian is talking about that holistic impact from running Super 8, how far does this impact spread? And I'm talking about the effect that it has on the society. From, running the Super 8, for example, what has been the impact, not just the players themselves, but even to their families?
Well, for impact has been very visible. It's been amazing the last 15 years, what we've seen at the community level. There are certain clubs have expanded their spectator base, have had spin-off business ideas from the side on football pitch. Very good examples: Jericho, All-Star, United. These are teams that they are community-based clubs, but with Super 8, they had a platform to be able to showcase the talent of the young players and also be able to sort of organize and mobilize community to back them. And first time we saw the villages or the estates around those clubs following them away games. That's never happened in recent years. So the awareness has been created through these competitive games. But most importantly, the off-pitch been running, especially around capacity building of the coaches, referee, and also the manager of the clubs or the officials of the clubs, has helped to some level of sanity, or rather some form of within the clubs that the clubs have realized and have seen. It can lead to better prospects for their boys to go into bigger clubs, and it has happened. We've had from I think the last 2 seasons about 20 players who progressed to bigger leagues and financial literacy programs off pitch, where we train them on how to manage resources and to manage revenues and to start their own businesses. We've seen the community also investing in the clubs because they can see this lighter tunnel for their boys. So the impact has been great. It still needs a lot of work. The 2 key areas of investment would be infrastructure. All panelists are building of the right infrastructure in white elephants, but basic infrastructure, and also capacity building within the club and the capacity, meaning coaches and the clubs, and also their support, which includes the stewards, so forth.
I think I want us now to get the context right, and I want us to be pragmatic here. There are rifts all over the place in this country. You have a federation leadership that feels they are the alpha and omega, and if you have to do anything, then you must involve them. And in the end, we are having all these fights left, right, center. How do we then harmonize our working so that then we give due respect to the federation, but also they allow those of us who want to do this for the grassroots, for the passion of the game. What kind of engagement do we then need to have? Because at the end of the day, we will be talking about all these good things, but as long as there are those little things that impede us from engaging, then we are not going to get very far. And I mean, Hussein, for me, I'll keep talking about Super 8 because of the kind of fights that you've had to deal with from a leadership of the federation that does not really appreciate the role that other people want to play. How do we, ground these issues so that then we can be able to enjoy what we want to do for football?
I think, Milton, to something on that is it comes back to integrity. We have approached work with them. And actually, at the beginning of our activities, we worked with the federation in 2004 to 2007, I think. And it's about integrity. It's very difficult to engage a group who might not see the vision, who have integrity in terms of implementation of ideas or what the mission is. So it all boils down to the caliber of leadership we have at these institutions, and it cuts across all sports. It's not just unique to football. So football is grassroots football is the foundation of anything. Every successful football superpower has a very strong grassroots movement foundation. You cannot have a stable roof if your foundation is weak. It will collapse. So if the federation realizes this and keep fighting people who want to implement programs at that level, then we will never be successful. And this is the challenge that we face. So matters of integrity when it comes to government operations is very, very important. You need vision. We need people who have integrity and credibility. And this is a cancer that is not only eating our federation here, but also look at FIFA and the issues that have come up within the recent couple of years, that the rot seems to be from the head. So until FIFA gets its act in order, also brings and does the same to the federations across the world, especially in Africa. This issue is persistent in Africa. I don't know why we tolerate mediocrity, we tolerate corruption, and that is why grassroots football does not grow. We made a decision a long time ago to do our thing and to move on and to implement our vision, and we've done it successfully over the years. But it doesn't have to be acrimonious. So it's an unfortunate situation, but we are hopeful that there'll be sanity very soon once action is taken on the corruption.
Thank you, Hussein. As you respond to that, gentlemen, we need to wind this up now. I would expect that as you respond to that, Jay, Tom, and Brian, you also make your closing remarks in terms of how we can then move this forward. I'll start with you, Jay.
Absolutely. I think echoing what Hussein has said, and also echoing what Tom said earlier, there is an essential part of this that relies on the flexibility that's allowed to these smaller organizations. In my understanding, I think that the most successful football organizations in the world, they have a centralized, a centralized head that kind of formalizes the rules and the regulations for each level of sport. But then they allow lots of flexibility when it comes to that level, and they allow that level to have its own governing body as well. Now, of course, that governing body will fall under the jurisdiction of the larger one, but there isn't as much of that, say, level of control where people feel restricted in what they're capable to do. And I think that's an essential part of allowing the game to grow at all levels, from the professional level down to the amateur level, down to the grassroots level. And I think that's how you will also see more evolution of the sport itself. You know, the sport is not the same that it was 30, 40 years ago. And that's because of the flexibility that's been allowed and because of the progression that's been allowed as well. And those things take time, but it has to be intentional as well. And I think that's kind of my closing remark as well, is that as Hussein was saying, it depends a lot on the integrity of the organizations, but also what each player in that organization wants to achieve, be it from the governing bodies down to the individual club level.
Tom, is it should we tremble and fear when authorities want to stop us from what we are doing, yet as they point at us, four fingers are pointing at themselves, or should we continue, and would we be defying anybody or anyone if we proceeded and did the right thing?
Well, I mean, as far as my closing remark goes, Milton, I mean, I think I'll move away from a kind of any kind of rhetoric or conflict. I think it's important that we kind of we find a common ground where both government and federations and the bodies that regulate football are able to incentivize being part and being within their own structures of governance. So if you're a registered club within FKF, then there are benefits within, by being part of that. If you are not part of the FKF as a registered club, then that should be fine. I feel that if we're going to move grassroots football forwards in Kenya, I think it's important that regardless of your registration as a club or as an entity within the government, I think there are certain non-negotiables and certain things that should be provided to grassroots clubs regardless of their status as registered or not registered. I think having access to coach education should be just a non-negotiable. That should be accessible for everyone, whether you're registered or non-registered. I don't feel as if facilities should be available to everyone who is registered. I'm not registered. I think, again, if you're taking the responsibility to be a community club and not register yourself with government or not necessarily with government, but with federation, then you're taking the responsibility to run your operations yourself and however you see fit. But I think from a regulatory perspective, it's very important that that there are certain things that are provided to clubs so that they can grow, because we need to accept that within grassroots football and within that space, there is an incredible amount of serendipity that happens when we look at developing players and developing coaches. So giving clubs the freedom to operate and the freedom to have their institutions structured the way they want to is important. But if they want to be part of a progressive football pyramid within Kenya, then at some point they're going to need to be regulated, and there shouldn't be any arguments against that. That's the way it exists all over the world.
Unfortunately, Brian, and I'm being honest here, you have a leadership of FKF or the powers that be that may not really appreciate or embrace your concept of football for development. And I'm sure sometimes you would, run roughshod with them. How do we get this done, especially from your perspective? Because it is broader for you than just football for football. In less than 1 minute, Brian.
I don't know if I'll make it in less than 1 minute. I will try. And I think it's good that Hussein has brought in the issue of FIFA and saying it's a problem in Africa. And I'll just echo that and say, for me, I'm not pointing the finger at our federations or to somebody specific. Or rather, we should start looking at structure. And as Jay has rightly mentioned, football has evolved. It's not the same thing it was 30 or 40 years ago. But let's look at our structures. Have they even evolved with the time? For example, are our football institutions incorporating good governance or corporate governance in their management? I think once we start looking at these structures critically and looking to improve them, then we'll see changes. Otherwise, what we see are just events and patterns that reflect on a structure not only locally but globally. And when it comes to embracing football for development of sport for development, again, it's not a matter of conflict. I think it's what you put on the table as value and who is to buy into that value that matters. Let's be more innovative about what we are doing with football, what we are doing in sports. Sure, we'll be able to develop our grassroots football.
Hussein, you'll have the last bite of the cherry in 30 seconds, your closing thoughts.
Thank you. Mine is to really thank all the panelists. I mean, it's been quite inspirational to hear from all of them, learned a few things, and to thank also the organizers. But for us to be able to grow grassroots football, I think stakeholders need to appreciate the challenges that we face. Government plays a very big role, the federation does as well, but also us as individuals can do whatever we can in our capacities to make sure that it flourishes within our spheres of influence and within our environment. I don't have anything much to say other than that to show gratitude to all the panelists and the organizers of this particular event. and hopefully we can be able to continue with these conversations again within this particular platform and other platforms.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, the four panelists. Tom LEG, progressive football professional in management and coaching experience. HUSSEIN MOHAMED, CEO, Extreme Sports. Brian WESAALA, a seasoned IT professional and the founder of Football Foundation for Africa. And finally, JAI SANSHARMA, specialist in football knowledge and holder of a BSc in sports management. As we say, the conversation continues on this platform online, and we continue engaging, but the beautiful game may not have been as beautiful recently in this country, but we hope that the madness will go away and reason will prevail at the end of the day. On behalf of the team that put this together, I am Milton Nyakundi, and once again we want to remind you to stay safe in this era of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a year to be alive. Therefore, do all you can, have your mask on, keep social distancing, sanitize, wash your hands. This is a year to be alive. Once again, our thoughts are with the families and the individuals that are battling the pandemic, those who have tested positive, and our condolences as well to those that have succumbed to the pandemic. That's it for now. But Kenya International Sport Film Festival continues. Today is only day one. So let's keep the fun. Sports brings us together, and it is even more fun when there's film involved. Good afternoon.
Wow. Whenever it comes to soccer or football, the beautiful game, whatever you want to call it, it's always heated and passionate, especially in Kenya.
Well, everyone loves the sport, and everyone wants to play the sport. They get any free evening, all they want to do is kick a ball around. It doesn't matter the size of the plot of land. It's 10 meters by 10 meters. They'll play 3-a-sides. And just look at the children with the balls, and also those that they've made. We call them juala here.
Yeah, juala.
Juala balls. That little ball, and if you own one, you're actually the FIFA president of your zone. So you can actually control how much football is played. That's how football is serious.
You're saying the FIFA president has his own juala?
If you own the football out there in the estates, when you are the kid and you own the football, you are the FIFA president. You decide to take a nap on the ball, and everyone will have to wait for you to wake up.
Okay, so grassroots development. It should start when? How old? Should it be part of the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development? Should Ministry of Education look into this? Should they rope it into Ministry of Health? Because then it fits in with universal health care, which is part of the presidential agenda.
I mean, it's a very simple thing. It will serve all those purposes.
Exactly.
And all you just need is for the local authorities, wherever they are, the county governments in the country, and in the capital, the Nairobi Metropolitan Service,
yes,
let us have the ground there. If somebody's got land that they can use, and they say, let it be used for this and this. Over the holidays, most of the primary schools across the country and secondary schools have got play fields and all that.
Yes.
Let the community go there,
yes,
but give them a caveat. Make sure that you leave the grass as good as it was for the students who come back.
I'm seeing quite messages being sent here across the land, especially by our president, Uhuru Kenyatta. Recently, he was groundbreaking for a stadium for Gor Mahia. The other day, he was at Langata Barracks, preparing the ground for Ulinzi FC. Is there something happening here that we're not seeing?
Well, those are the key facilities for competitive sports right at the top. But it now comes down. We can't keep looking up to the national government. Right. Sport is a devolved function. Most of the grounds that used to be known as Moi Stadium somewhere are now in the hands of county governments.
Yes.
Let them do their role. All those grounds down that were held by county councils now, those are, in the mashinani, as we'd call it, real grassroots areas. Those ones now belong to the people. Let them get into great shape. So open them up to the public.
Soccer, football is now devolved. Or it has also been.
Every sport is a devolved function.
Yes.
It's just a policy at the national level, funding of national teams and the registration of federations at the national level. That's with the State Department for Sport. But as a function, identifying talent, ensuring that the facilities are there, that is a devolved function.
That is awesome. Now, special thanks to the work that HUSSEIN MOHAMED is doing, the work that Brian WESAALA is doing as well. Special thanks to JAI SANSHARMA and Tom LEG, and of course to MILTON NYAKUNDI and the work that he continues to do. He's very passionate, I know, just like you are, about not just soccer, but sports in general.
Sports in general.
And our next feature is actually about soccer. It's a movie called As We Are. And it's about Peru, the nation of Peru, returning to the World Cup after 36 years. And this was in 2018. Enjoy. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Yeah.
And keep on watching. Kenya International Sports Film Festival 2020, the virtual edition.